January 17th, 1945. Houffalize, Belgium. 14:42 hours. The snow fell in curtains across the Ardennes forest, muffling the world beneath a blanket of frozen silence. Inside the belly of a Panther Ausf G, 5 German soldiers sat rigid in the dark, their breath crystallizing in the steel tomb that had once felt invincible. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann pressed his eye to the gunner's optic, his gloved fingers numb against the traverse wheel. The forest ahead was a monochrome labyrinth of shattered pines and abandoned foxholes, the kind of terrain where death arrived without warning. Then, through the swirling white, a figure emerged. At first, Hartmann thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by wind-bent branches, perhaps a deer driven mad by weeks of artillery. But the shape took form. A single American soldier, walking upright through the open ground, his rifle slung across his back, his arms hanging loose at his sides. He wore no helmet. His stride was measured, deliberate, as if he were strolling through a summer meadow rather than crossing a kill zone less than 80 meters from a 60-ton Predator armed with a 75mm cannon. Hartmann's hand froze on the firing mechanism. Behind him, the loader whispered a prayer in Swabian dialect. The commander, Lieutenant Werner Steiner, leaned forward from his cupola seat, squinting through his own periscope, his mouth slightly open. None of them moved. The Panther's engine idled, a low growl that should have been a warning, but the American did not flinch. He did not run. He did not duck behind cover. He simply walked. And in that impossible moment, as the snow continued to fall and the forest held its breath, something inside the German crew, something forged in 6 years of war, hardened by 1,000 battles, sharpened by ideology and survival, cracked like river ice in spring. This was not how the war was supposed to end. December 1944, the Ardennes Offensive. 6 weeks earlier, the Wehrmacht had launched its final desperate gamble in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last roll of the dice, a concentrated thrust through the same Belgian forests that had carried his armies to glory in 1940. The plan was audacious, perhaps insane. Smash through the thinly held American lines, race to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets arrived at the gates of Berlin. For the men of the panzer divisions assigned to the offensive, there was a flicker of the old confidence. They had been promised fuel, air support, and the element of surprise. More importantly, they had been promised that the Americans, those soft, undisciplined citizen soldiers from across the ocean, would break under the weight of German steel just as the French had, just as so many others had before them. Klaus Hartmann believed it, at least in part. At 24, he was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a survivor of Kursk and the long, grinding retreat across the Ukraine. He had seen what German armor could do when properly deployed. He had also seen what happened when it wasn't. The burned-out hulks along the roads, the crews who never made it out, the silent columns of prisoners marching east into oblivion. But the West was different, they told themselves. The Americans didn't fight like the Russians. They didn't have the same hunger, the same willingness to die in waves. The offensive began before dawn on December 16, 1944, with the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since D-Day. German infantry poured through the mist-shrouded forests, overrunning isolated American positions, capturing entire battalions before they could radio for help. The panzers followed, their tracks churning through mud and snow, their commanders scanning the horizon for the first signs of collapse. And for a few days, it worked. The Americans reeled. Green divisions, stationed in what was supposed to be a quiet sector, found themselves surrounded. Towns fell. Supply dumps burned. The bulge deepened, a dark salient pushing west toward the Meuse River. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels proclaimed a turning point. In the frozen forests of Belgium, Klaus Hartmann allowed himself to hope. But hope, like fuel, was a finite resource. The reality of winter war. By early January 1945, the offensive had stalled. The Americans had not broken. They had bent, certainly. Entire regiments had been mauled, thousands captured. But they had not shattered. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne, surrounded but unbroken, resupplied by air, while the German spearheads bled themselves white against its perimeter. Patton's Third Army wheeled north with a speed that seemed impossible, smashing into the southern flank of the Bulge. The weather cleared, and with it came the Allied fighter bombers, screaming out of the sky to turn German columns into funeral pyres. For Hartmann and his crew, the war became a nightmare of retreat and improvisation. Fuel convoys never arrived. When they did, they carried barely enough to move the Panther a few kilometers before it coughed and died again. Rations dwindled to frozen bread and ersatz coffee that tasted like charcoal. Ammunition was rationed. Every shell counted. The crew learned to sleep inside the tank, pressed against the freezing steel, because outside meant frostbite or death from American patrols. They had expected to be liberators, returning the West to German control. Instead, they became scavengers, stripping wrecked vehicles for parts, siphoning fuel from abandoned trucks, digging the Panther out of snowdrifts with their bare hands. The radio brought only bad news. Divisions surrounded, towns retaken, the Führer's promised reinforcements diverted to the Eastern Front, where the Soviets were already crossing into Germany itself. And then there were the Americans. They did not fight like the propaganda had promised. They were not cowards. They did not surrender en masse when faced with superior armor. Instead, they adapted. They learned. They brought up their tank destroyers, those low-slung, fast-moving killers that could punch through a Panther's side armor at 1,000 meters. They called in artillery with a precision that seemed almost casual, as if they had an infinite supply of shells and the luxury to use them. They coordinated with their air support in ways the Luftwaffe had not managed in years. But more than that, and this was what unsettled Hartmann most, they seemed confident. Even in retreat, even when taking casualties, the American soldiers carried themselves with a kind of easy assurance, as if they knew, on some fundamental level, that they were going to win. Not because they were better soldiers necessarily, but because they represented something larger than themselves. They had full stomachs, they had warm coats, they had mail from home, and hot coffee and cigarettes that they traded freely, even with German prisoners. The contrast was devastating. The object, the K-ration. Among the items looted from captured American positions, nothing symbolized the gulf between the two armies more perfectly than the K-ration. These small cardboard boxes, designed to sustain a soldier for a single day, became objects of almost mythical status among German troops. Each box contained not just food, but an entire philosophy of war, packaged in waxed paper and tin. There were crackers, not the hard, tasteless bricks the Wehrmacht issued, but actual biscuits with flavor. There was cheese, dense and rich. There were cigarettes, 4 to a pack, high-quality tobacco wrapped in clean white paper. There was instant coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory sludge that passed for it in German rations. There was chocolate, thick and sweet. There was even toilet paper, a luxury that had vanished from German supply lines years ago. Hartmann's loader, a boy named Friedrich from Hamburg, had found a K-ration box in a foxhole near Bastogne. He opened it with the reverence one might show a religious relic, laying out each component on the hull of the Panther. The crew gathered around, silent. They divided it 5 ways, each man taking a careful portion, chewing slowly to make it last. "They eat like this every day," Friedrich said quietly. "Every single day." No one replied. What was there to say? The K-ration was not just food, it was proof. Proof that the enemy had so much industrial capacity, so much wealth, that they could afford to wrap individual meals in cardboard and ship them across an ocean. Proof that while German soldiers scrounged for frozen turnips, their opponents were sustained by an economic machine so vast it could afford to be wasteful. The K-ration became a recurring presence in Hartmann's thoughts. He found more of them as the retreat continued, scattered in abandoned trenches, discarded beside roads, sometimes half-eaten, as if the Americans found them unworthy of finishing. Each one was a small humiliation, a reminder that Germany was not fighting a war of soldiers against soldiers, but a war of industrial systems, and that the system across the ocean was winning by sheer material abundance. January 12, 1945. The order to hold. By mid-January, the bulge had become a trap. The salient was collapsing, pinched from north and south by converging Allied armies. Any rational military logic demanded immediate withdrawal to defensible positions along the Rhine. But rational military logic had ceased to govern German strategy. The order from Army Group B was explicit: hold every meter of ground. No retreat without permission. Any officer who withdrew without authorization would face a court-martial and, likely, execution. Lieutenant Steiner read the order aloud in the cramped commander's cupola, his voice flat. The crew sat in silence. They had perhaps 30 liters of fuel remaining, enough for maybe 20 kilometers of movement, less in heavy snow. They had 18 main gun rounds. Their radio had been intermittent for days, crackling with static and fragmented reports of encirclements. The infantry that was supposed to support them had melted away, either killed, captured, or simply vanished into the forest in small groups seeking their own salvation. "We hold," Steiner said finally. "That's the order." Hartmann wanted to ask what they were holding for, but he already knew the answer. Nothing. They were holding because retreat meant acknowledging defeat, and acknowledging defeat meant accepting that 6 years of sacrifice, of conquest and glory and blood had led to this. 5 exhausted men in a freezing steel box, waiting for the inevitable. They positioned the Panther in a tree line overlooking a shallow valley, the gun aimed down the axis of a logging road that might serve as an American approach route. They draped camouflage netting over the hull and turret, though the fresh snow made it almost irrelevant. They waited. The days blurred together. They rationed their food to 2 small meals daily. They melted snow for water. They took turns on watch, 2 hours each, eyes straining through optics for movement. At night, the sky to the west glowed red with artillery fire, a constant reminder that the war was still raging somewhere beyond their frozen pocket of forest. On the 5th day, January 17th, the American appeared. 1442 hours. The encounter. Hartmann saw him first, a lone figure emerging from the tree line on the far side of the valley, perhaps 300 meters away. Through the optic, the image was grainy, distorted by falling snow, but unmistakable. A soldier in an American uniform, olive drab against white, walking in the open with no apparent concern for cover or concealment. "Target," Hartmann whispered into the intercom. "Infantry, single, 300 meters." Steiner swiveled his periscope. "I see him. What the hell is he doing?" The American continued forward. He was not running. He was not crouching. His rifle remained slung. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, as if he were alone in the world, as if there were no war, no danger, no German tank watching him through a killing optic. "Orders?" Hartmann asked. His hand hovered over the traverse wheel, his finger near the trigger for the coaxial machine gun. One burst would end it. 3 seconds of fire, and the figure would crumple into the snow, just another casualty in a war already swollen with millions. But Steiner did not answer. The lieutenant sat frozen in his cupola, watching. Behind Hartmann, the loader and driver had abandoned their positions to peer through vision ports, trying to understand what they were seeing. The American crossed the 200-meter mark, then 150. His face was visible now through the optic, young, maybe 20, with a thin beard and hollow eyes. He wore no helmet, and his hair was matted with snow. His hands were empty, hanging at his sides. He did not look at the Panther, did not seem to register its presence, though the tank's bulk was impossible to miss against the tree line. "Shoot him," Friedrich whispered. "Shoot him before he calls artillery." But Hartmann could not. His finger remained motionless. The traverse wheel did not turn. The American walked closer. 100 meters. Hartmann could hear the man's footsteps now, the soft crunch of boots on snow, audible even through the Panther's armor. He could see the insignia on the man's collar, an infantry private, unremarkable, the kind of soldier the Wehrmacht had faced 10,000 times before. But there was something in the way he moved, not aggression, not fear, but a kind of resigned exhaustion that rendered all tactical considerations meaningless. 80 meters. 70. "Why isn't he running?" the driver asked, his voice cracking. Steiner finally spoke, his tone distant, almost philosophical. "He doesn't care." And that was it, Hartmann realized. That was what paralyzed them. The American had not come to attack. He had not come to surrender. He was simply walking because there was nothing else left to do. He had reached a point beyond fear, beyond survival instinct, a place where the war had burned away everything except the simple mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other. It was the opposite of everything the Wehrmacht had been taught. German doctrine emphasized aggression, will, the triumph of spirit over material. But here was a soldier who had abandoned will entirely, who had given himself over to pure fatality, and in doing so had become invulnerable. How do you shoot a man who does not care if he dies? 60 meters. 50. The American stopped. He stood in the open, arms at his sides, facing the Panther directly now. For the first time, his eyes lifted to meet the gun barrel pointed at his chest. He did not raise his hands. He did not kneel. He simply stood, swaying slightly, waiting. Hartmann's breath came in shallow gasps. His vision narrowed to the crosshairs centered on the man's torso. One squeeze. That was all it would take. But the crosshairs wavered. His hand trembled. In the optic, the American's face was expressionless, carved from ice and exhaustion. There was no hatred there, no ideology, only a terrible, empty patience. 40 meters. "We should," Friedrich began. The American turned away. Not quickly, not with any sense of urgency, but with the same unhurried deliberation he had shown throughout. He walked perpendicular to the Panther's gun, crossing the valley at an angle, disappearing back into the tree line on the opposite side. He did not look back. Within a minute, the forest swallowed him, and he was gone. The tank sat in silence. Hartmann realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled, a long, shuddering release, and slumped back from the optic. His hands were shaking. Around him, the crew remained motionless, each man processing what they had just witnessed, or failed to witness. "Why didn't you fire?" Friedrich asked finally, his voice accusing. Hartmann had no answer. Steiner climbed down from the cupola and sat heavily on an ammunition crate, his face grey. The lieutenant pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket, his last, saved for some undefined future moment, and lit it with trembling hands. He took a long drag, the ember glowing in the dim interior. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," Steiner said quietly. "If we killed him, 100 more would come. 1,000. They're not like us. They don't run out. They just keep coming." The ideology confronted. That night, as the crew huddled in the Panther against temperatures that had dropped to -15°C, Hartmann found himself unable to sleep. His mind returned again and again to the American's face, to the hollow eyes and the empty hands, to the terrifying indifference of a man who had outlasted even the survival instinct. Hartmann had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, swept up in the euphoria of victories that seemed to validate everything the regime had promised. German superiority, Lebensraum, the destiny of a master race. He had seen the newsreels of Paris falling, of British soldiers evacuating from Dunkirk, of endless columns of Soviet prisoners shuffling east. He had believed, or at least wanted to believe, that Germany was writing history, that the new order was inevitable. But the American had shattered that belief without firing a shot. Here was a soldier from a nation the propaganda had dismissed as weak, materialistic, racially mongrelized. A nation of shopkeepers and jazz musicians who could never match German discipline and will. And yet this soldier had walked through a kill zone with the same inevitability as sunrise, untouched not because of cowardice, but because of a kind of moral exhaustion that transcended the categories of victory and defeat. The Americans did not need to believe in their superiority. They simply existed, backed by an industrial apparatus so vast that belief became irrelevant. They had the K rations, they had the fuel, they had the artillery shells and the air support and the replacements shipped across an ocean that might as well have been infinite. They could afford to lose battles, lose men, lose entire campaigns, and still return stronger than before. Germany could not. Every loss was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed represented scarce steel and fuel that would never be replenished. Every soldier killed left a gap that grew wider with each passing day. The Americans fought a war of addition. The Wehrmacht fought one of subtraction. And subtraction, Hartmann understood now, always reached zero eventually. The K-ration appeared in his thoughts again. That small cardboard box with its obscene abundance. It was not a weapon, but it was more devastating than any bomb. It proved that the war had never been a contest of wills or ideologies, but a simple equation of resources. And in that equation, Germany had been bankrupt from the beginning, borrowing time through skill and audacity until the creditors came to collect. The American walking through the snow was a creditor. He did not need to fight because time was on his side. He could afford to be indifferent, could afford to walk away, because behind him was an entire continent gearing its industry toward his victory. What did one German tank matter against that? January 21st, 1945. The final withdrawal. 4 days after the encounter, the order finally came. Withdraw to the Siegfried Line. By then, it was almost too late. The Allies had closed the bulge, trapping thousands of German soldiers in pockets that were being systematically reduced. Hartmann's crew used their last fuel to start the Panther's engine, coaxing it to life with prayers and profanity. They abandoned most of their ammunition, keeping only 5 main gun rounds in case they encountered enemy armor during the retreat. The journey east was a vision of apocalypse. The roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, abandoned guns, and columns of silent infantry trudging through the snow with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. American fighter bombers harassed them when the weather cleared, strafing anything that moved. The Panther broke down twice. Each time, the crew managed to restart it through sheer desperation, knowing that to be left behind meant capture or death. They crossed back into Germany on January 28th, 2 days after Hitler officially called off the offensive. The crew was reduced to skeletons, their uniforms hanging loose, their faces gaunt and frostbitten. The Panther limped into a depot near Prüm, its engine smoking, its tracks half shredded. Mechanics swarmed over it immediately, less to repair than to cannibalize it for parts to keep other tanks running. Hartmann and his crew were given 48 hours of rest, hot food, and orders to report to a replacement unit forming near Bonn. None of them discussed the American. None of them needed to. The memory hung between them like a ghost, unspoken but inescapable. February 1945. The unraveling. The final months of the war were a blur of retreats and last stands. Hartmann served in 3 different tank crews as vehicles were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. He saw the Rhine crossed, saw American armor pouring into the German heartland, saw cities reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. He saw children pressed into uniform, armed with Panzerfausts, and told to die for a Führer who had retreated to a bunker beneath Berlin. And everywhere, he saw evidence of the American abundance. Captured supply dumps overflowed with rations, fuel, and ammunition. American soldiers ate better as invaders in Germany than most German civilians had eaten in years. They distributed chocolate to German children, not out of malice, but because they had so much they could afford generosity. Their tanks rolled forward in endless columns, replaced as fast as they were knocked out, while German defenders husbanded their last few Panthers and Tigers like miser's gold. The K-ration haunted him. He found them in abandoned foxholes, in wrecked vehicles, scattered along roadsides. Each one was a small monument to the futility of German resistance. You could not defeat a nation that packaged its ideology in cardboard boxes and shipped it across an ocean by the millions. You could not outlast an enemy that treated war as a logistical problem to be solved, rather than a test of racial will. On April 16, 1945, Hartmann surrendered to American forces near the Elbe River. He had no tank, no unit, and no orders. He walked out of a forest with his hands raised, joining a long column of prisoners being marched toward a temporary camp. An American sergeant searched him, confiscated his sidearm, and handed him a K-ration box. "You look hungry, pal," the sergeant said in accented German. "Get some food in you." Hartmann took the box with numb hands. He did not open it. He simply held it, feeling its weight, its compact density, the casual generosity of a nation that could afford to feed even its enemies. He thought of the American in the snow, walking toward the Panther with empty hands and hollow eyes. He understood now what that walk had meant. Not surrender, not bravery, but a simple statement of fact. We do not need to defeat you. We only need to exist, and you will defeat yourselves. Epilogue: The Weight of Abundance. After the war, Klaus Hartmann returned to what remained of his family's farm outside Stuttgart. The house was intact, though the barns had been destroyed by artillery. His father was dead, killed in the bombing of Hamburg. His mother had survived, gaunt and aged beyond her years, subsisting on Red Cross rations and what little the land could produce. He did not speak of the war, not to her, not to the other veterans he encountered in the refugee camps and displaced persons queues. What was there to say? That they had believed in something that turned out to be a lie. that they had fought for a vision of superiority that had been undone, not by enemy soldiers, but by enemy productivity. That the war had been lost the moment the first American factory began converting from automobiles to tanks, from toasters to artillery shells. In 1947, the Marshall Plan began. American aid flowed into Germany, rebuilding what American bombs had destroyed. Food arrived in crates marked with white stars. Tractors, fuel, seed grain, medical supplies, all of it stamped with the same casual abundance that had characterized those K-ration boxes. Hartman's mother wept when the first relief trucks arrived in their village, handing out chocolate and powdered milk and white bread. She could not understand it, could not reconcile the generosity with the memory of bombers overhead. But Hartman understood. This was not charity. This was demonstration. The Americans were proving, once again, that they could afford to be magnanimous, that their system produced so much surplus they could rebuild their enemies and still grow richer. It was the same message the K-ration had carried, the same truth the lone soldier had embodied by walking through the snow. We have more than enough. We will always have more than enough. And that is why we won. He kept a single item from the war, hidden in a cigar box beneath his bed. A K-ration carton, empty but intact, its cardboard faded and worn. He never showed it to anyone. It was not a trophy, not a souvenir in any conventional sense. It was a talisman, a physical reminder of the moment when ideology had collided with reality and shattered like glass. On quiet nights, when the farm was dark and his mother asleep, Hartman would take out the box and turn it over in his hands. He would run his fingers across the English text he could not fully read, across the cheerful illustrations and nutritional information. And he would remember the American, walking through the snow, untouchable not because of courage or skill, but because he represented something that could not be defeated by tanks or tactics or will. He represented enough. Enough food, enough fuel, enough steel, enough people, enough time, enough everything. And against enough, ideology was meaningless. Against enough, racial superiority was a fantasy. Against enough, the 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and crumbled into ash. The Panther had been a magnificent machine, perhaps the best tank produced by any nation during the war. But it had required scarce steel, scarce fuel, scarce trained crews. The Americans had fielded the Sherman, inferior in almost every technical specification, but they had fielded it by the tens of thousands, with fuel to run it, and shells to fire, and crews to replace casualties. The Sherman won not because it was better, but because it was enough. That was the lesson Hartman carried forward, the knowledge that haunted him through the Reconstruction years and into the uncertain peace of the Cold War. Victory did not go to the purest ideology, or the strongest will, or the most disciplined soldiers. Victory went to the side that could afford to lose and keep fighting, that could waste resources because resources were not scarce, that could package its entire philosophy of life into a small cardboard box and scatter them across the battlefields of Europe like seeds. Democracy, he came to understand, was not a political system. It was a production system. It created abundance, and abundance created resilience, and resilience outlasted any amount of fanatical will. The American had walked through the snow because he knew, consciously or not, that his nation could afford his death. Germany could not afford the death of a single Panther crew, and that made all the difference. Coda, the symbolic walk. In the decades after the war, as historians analyzed the Battle of the Bulge and the collapse of Nazi Germany, few paid attention to small, individual moments like the encounter between Hartman's crew and the lone American soldier. There were no official records of it, no after-action reports, no medals or commendations. It was simply one of 10,000 small incidents that composed the vast mosaic of the war's end. But for Hartmann, it remained the single most important moment of his service. Not the battles on the Eastern Front, not the desperate retreat through Belgium, not even the moment of surrender, but those few minutes when a hollow-eyed American private walked across a kill zone and forced a German tank crew to confront the emptiness of their cause. The walk was symbolic because it was not strategic. It served no tactical purpose. It advanced no objective. It was the action of a man who had moved beyond the war's logic into a space where the only remaining choice was to continue existing. And in that choice, he had embodied the fundamental truth that had decided the conflict. The Americans could afford exhaustion, could afford indifference, could afford to keep walking, even when it seemed pointless. Germany could afford none of those things. Every action had to count. Every bullet had to hit. Every tank had to survive. There was no margin for error, no reserves to draw upon, no luxury of waste. The moment the Wehrmacht lost the initiative, the moment it was forced to react rather than act, the outcome became inevitable. The Americans' walk was the war in miniature. One man, backed by incomprehensible resources, moving forward with the absolute certainty that eventually the other side would simply run out. Of fuel, of ammunition, of food, of men, of will. And when they ran out, he would still be walking. Klaus Hartmann died in 1983, a week before his 62nd birthday, of heart failure, brought on by decades of work and cigarettes, and the accumulated stress of having lived through history's darkest chapter. His mother had passed years before. His farm was sold to developers who turned it into a housing subdivision. The cigar box containing the K-ration carton was discarded by estate cleaners who assumed it was trash. But the memory remained, passed down through veteran circles and half-remembered stories. The tale of the American who walked toward a panther and lived because the Germans inside could not bring themselves to fire. It became apocryphal, embellished and distorted, until it was impossible to separate fact from myth. Yet the core remained true. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the dying days of the Third Reich's last gamble, a single unarmed soldier had demonstrated what all the strategic bombing and armored assaults and industrial might had been proving for years. That America did not need to defeat Germany through courage or brilliance or superior tactics. It only needed to be, to exist, to produce, to continue, to replace its losses faster than the enemy could inflict them, to walk forward, unhurried and inevitable, until the other side had nothing left with which to resist. That was the truth Klaus Hartmann carried to his grave. That was the lesson contained in a small cardboard box. That was the meaning of a walk through the snow. Freedom was not an ideology. It was logistics. And logistics, in the end, always won.